February 23, 1944. 25,000 feet above occupied Germany. Outside temperature, minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the cockpit of B-17 Flying Fortress, Yankee Doodle. 23-year-old Lieutenant John Morgan from Ohio checked his instruments one more time. 300 bombers surrounded him in formation, all heading toward the Messerschmitt aircraft factory in Regensburg. In 4 minutes, his bomber would become a flying coffin, but he wouldn't abandon his crew. The mission had started normally at 0600 hours at Thorpe Abbott's airbase. Morgan's crew consisted of 10 men. Co-pilot Lieutenant James Chen from California. Navigator Lieutenant Robert Walsh from Massachusetts. Bombardier Staff Sergeant David Klein from New York. Flight Engineer Technical Sergeant Frank Russo from Pennsylvania. Radio Operator Staff Sergeant
Avoiding known
William
flak
Hayes
concentrations near
from
Brussels.
Texas.
The target, Regensburg, is
Ball
marked
turret
here.
gunner,
Secondary
Sergeant
approach if
Michael
needed will skirt
O'Brien
Munich to the north.
from Illinois. Waist gunners Sergeant Thomas Rivera from Arizona and Sergeant Charles Anderson from Michigan. Tail gunner Sergeant Henry Jackson from Georgia. They'd flown 15 missions together. Today would be their 16th. B-17 Flying Fortresses earned their name. 4 Wright Cyclone engines, 13 50 caliber machine guns, maximum bomb load of 8,000 pounds, cruising speed 180 miles per hour. The aircraft could absorb tremendous punishment and still fly. But pilots learned quickly that could absorb didn't mean would survive. The formation crossed into German airspace in 0943 hours. Morgan scanned the sky constantly. Luftwaffe fighters could appear from any direction. The clear winter sky offered perfect visibility, which meant German radar had tracked them since takeoff. Somewhere below, fighter squadrons were scrambling. At 0957 hours, the intercom crackled. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high." Jackson's voice from the tail position. Morgan's stomach tightened. Here they come.
Focke-Wulf FW-190s dove through the formation like wolves attacking a herd. Their cannons blazed. Tracer rounds streaked past Morgan's windscreen. The B-17 shuddered as bullets punched through aluminum skin. Behind him, Russo's top turret guns roared, ejecting hot brass casings that bounced off Morgan's flight boots. The first wave passed. Morgan did a quick check. "Damage report." One by one, his crew called in. Minor hits, nothing critical. They'd been lucky. At 10:12 hours, the second wave hit harder. This time, Messerschmitt Bf-109s joined the attack. They came from multiple angles simultaneously, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the formation's defensive firepower. Morgan held his course steady. Bombardiers needed stable platforms to hit targets. Evasive maneuvers would scatter the bomb pattern. An explosion erupted 50 feet to Morgan's left. A B-17 designated Memphis Belle II took a direct cannon hit to the No. 3 engine. The engine exploded in a ball of orange flame. The bomber nosed down and fell away, spinning toward the earth below. Morgan counted 3 parachutes. 7 men didn't make it out. At 10:18 hours, disaster struck Yankee Doodle. A Bf-109 made a head-on pass, its cannons firing at point-blank range. 20-millimeter shells tore through the bomber's nose section. The plexiglass nose shattered. Klein, the bombardier, died instantly. Walsh, the navigator, took shrapnel to his chest and collapsed over his desk. The shells continued through the bombardier compartment, ripping into the cockpit floor. Morgan felt the control column kick violently in his hands. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the instruments. The No. 2 engine burst into flames. Then the No. 1 engine started smoking. Both engines on the left wing compromised. The aircraft immediately lost altitude and began falling out of formation. Chen fought the controls beside him.
"We're losing pressure. Hydraulics are gone."
The co-pilot's voice remained steady despite the crisis. They'd trained for this, but training never fully prepared anyone for reality. Morgan made his assessment in seconds. 2 engines out. Hydraulic system destroyed. Flames spreading along the left wing. They were 90 miles inside enemy territory. The bomber was dying. Protocol was clear. Ring the bailout bell, evacuate the crew, save as many lives as possible. But there was a problem. The intercom system had been damaged in the attack. Morgan couldn't communicate with the entire crew. Some crew members in the rear of the aircraft had no idea how bad the damage was. If Morgan rang the bailout bell and jumped immediately, crew members in the tail section might not have enough time to reach their escape hatches before the aircraft entered an uncontrollable spin. Morgan looked at Chen. The co-pilot understood without words. Someone had to keep the bomber level long enough for everyone to escape. And that person was the aircraft commander. "Get them out," Morgan said quietly. "I'll hold her steady." Chen hesitated for only a second. Then he unbuckled his harness and headed toward the rear of the aircraft to physically alert the crew members who couldn't hear the bailout order. Morgan was now alone in the cockpit of a bomber that was actively burning. The left wing fire intensified. Flames crawled toward the fuselage. Morgan could feel the heat through the cockpit wall. The number 2 engine had become a blowtorch. Thick black smoke poured from the cowling. The aircraft wanted to roll left. Morgan had to use all his strength on the control column to maintain wings level flight. 60 seconds passed. Morgan's instruments showed the bomber losing altitude at 500 feet per minute. He fought to keep the nose up. If the aircraft nosed over, it would enter a dive that no one could pull out of. The crew members still inside would be trapped by centrifugal force. 90 seconds. Morgan glanced back through the cockpit door. Chen was moving through the fuselage, grabbing crew members, pushing them toward escape hatches. Rivera and Anderson, the waist gunners, were already gone. Good. 2 down, 7 to go. The fire reached the fuel tanks in the left wing. The entire wing became an inferno. Metal skin peeled away in strips. Morgan could see the internal structure of the wing through gaps in the burning aluminum. The wing was going to fail. When it did, the bomber would flip over and spin. Anyone still inside would die. 2 minutes. The aircraft dropped through 19,000 feet. Oxygen deprivation wasn't a concern anymore, but the loss of altitude meant German fighters could reach them more easily. Morgan scanned the sky. No fighters visible. They'd moved on to other targets. Small mercy. Chen appeared in the cockpit doorway. "Everyone's headed for the hatches." The co-pilot moved to his seat, reaching for his parachute. "Let's go." Morgan shook his head. "Not yet. Count to 30. Make sure they're clear of the aircraft before it goes down. Then you jump." "John, we don't have 30 seconds. "Then make it 20. Now go." Chen grabbed his parachute and disappeared. Morgan was completely alone. 3 minutes. The bomber passed through 17,000 feet. The fire had consumed most of the left wing. The structural spars were glowing red. Morgan felt the wing flexing.
It was about to separate from the fuselage. When that happened, the aircraft would cartwheel through the sky. Morgan counted in his head. He had to give his crew enough time. If he abandoned the controls too soon, the bomber would become uncontrollable before everyone escaped. He'd promised to bring them home. If home wasn't possible, he'd at least get them out alive. 3 minutes, 30 seconds. The wing spar snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The left wing folded upward at a 45-degree angle. The aircraft lurched violently to the left.
Morgan pulled back on the control column with everything he had. For a few more seconds, he maintained some semblance of control. 3 minutes, 45 seconds. The bomber entered a spin. Morgan released the controls. There was nothing more he could do from the pilot's seat. He unbuckled his harness, grabbed his parachute, and moved toward the escape hatch. The centrifugal force pulled him toward the left side of the spinning cockpit. He fought his way to the hatch. 4 minutes. Morgan reached the hatch and prepared to jump. The aircraft was spinning so violently that the G-forces made movement almost impossible. He positioned himself at the edge of the opening. Wind screamed past. Below him, Germany spread out in a patchwork of fields and forests. Morgan jumped. He fell away from the disintegrating bomber. Behind him, Yankee Doodle broke apart in mid-air. The wings separated from the fuselage. The tail section tumbled separately. Debris rained down across 5 square miles of German countryside. Morgan pulled his ripcord. The parachute deployed with a hard jerk. Suddenly, everything was quiet except for the wind. Morgan looked around. Other parachutes dotted the sky. He counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. All 9 crew members had escaped. Everyone except Klein and Walsh, who died in the initial attack. Morgan had kept his promise. His crew was alive. But now they were all behind enemy lines. The war was far from over. Morgan hit the ground hard in a snow-covered field somewhere in Bavaria. He rolled with the impact, exactly as training had taught him, and immediately gathered his parachute. The white silk would be visible for miles. He bunched it into a ball and looked for somewhere to hide it. A drainage ditch ran along the edge of the field. He stuffed the parachute into the ditch and covered it with snow and dead grass. The survival training kicked in automatically. Morgan checked his escape kit. Every American airman carried one. Inside, a silk map of Europe printed with escape routes. A compass disguised as a button. High-energy chocolate bars. Water purification tablets. A rubber water bottle. Benzodrine tablets to stay awake. German Reichsmarks. And a small hacksaw blade hidden in his boot heel. Morgan oriented himself using the compass. He was approximately 15 miles northeast of Regensburg. The Swiss border lay 180 miles south. Neutral Switzerland represented his best chance of avoiding capture. But crossing 180 miles of German territory in winter while wearing a U.S. Army Air Force's uniform presented challenges that made survival feel almost impossible. He needed civilian clothes, and he needed them quickly. Morgan moved toward a small forest visible half a mile away. Open fields were death traps. German civilians, police, and military would be searching for survivors. The crashed bomber had scattered wreckage across multiple kilometers. Search parties would comb the area systematically. As Morgan walked, he mentally reviewed the training. Rule 1. Move only at night. Rule 2. Avoid all contact with civilians. Rule 3. Never use roads. Rule 4. Eat sparingly. The chocolate bars in his kit represented 3 days of food if he rationed properly. After that, he'd have to forage or risk stealing from farms. He reached the tree line and pushed into the forest. The temperature hovered around freezing. His leather flight jacket provided some warmth, but he'd left his heavy fleece-lined jacket on the bomber. The jacket would have been too bulky for parachuting. Now he regretted that decision. Hypothermia would kill him before the Germans found him if he wasn't careful. Morgan found a hollow beneath a fallen oak tree and crawled inside. The space was barely large enough for him to sit upright, but it was invisible from outside. He would wait here until nightfall. His watch showed 10:47 hours. Sunset wouldn't come until approximately 17:30 hours. 7 hours of waiting in freezing temperatures. He allowed himself 1 square of chocolate. The sugar hit his system immediately, providing temporary energy. He knew it was an illusion. His body was running on adrenaline. When that wore off, exhaustion would follow. Time crawled. Morgan forced himself to stay awake. Falling asleep in these temperatures could be fatal. He did mental arithmetic, calculated distances, reviewed German phrases he'd memorized in training. Ich bin Amerikaner. I am American. Ich bin Kriegsgefangener. I am a prisoner of war. According to the Geneva Convention, captured airmen were supposed to be treated as prisoners of war, not criminals. But Morgan knew the reality was more complicated. At 13:30 hours, Morgan heard voices. German voices. Close. Very close. He froze. Through gaps in the fallen tree's root structure, he could see soldiers moving through the forest. Wehrmacht troops. They were conducting a search pattern, moving in a line, checking every possible hiding place. Morgan counted 8 soldiers, all armed with Kar 98K rifles. One carried an MP-40 submachine gun. The soldiers were speaking conversationally. Morgan's German wasn't good enough to understand complete sentences, but he caught fragments. Bomber. Crew. Reward. A reward. The German government offered rewards to civilians who captured Allied airmen. That meant every person in this region was now hunting him and his crew. The soldiers passed within 15 feet of Morgan's hiding place. One soldier stopped directly in front of the fallen tree. Morgan held his breath. The soldier lit a cigarette, stood there, smoking, for what felt like an eternity, then rejoined his unit. The search party moved on. Morgan waited another hour after the voices faded before emerging from his hiding place. That had been too close. He needed to put distance between himself and the crash site immediately. But first, he needed to find his crew. Morgan had seen 9 parachutes. That meant 9 men had survived the bailout. But where had they landed? The strong winds at altitude could have scattered them across miles. Finding them would be nearly impossible. Yet the thought of abandoning his crew felt wrong. He was their aircraft commander. They were his responsibility. Morgan made a decision. He would spend one night searching for survivors. If he found no one by dawn, he would head for Switzerland alone. It was the pragmatic choice. Staying in the area increased his capture risk exponentially. He waited until dark, then moved carefully through the forest. Every 50 meters, he stopped and gave the crew's recognition signal. 3 short whistles. It was risky. German patrols might hear. But without taking some risk, he'd never locate his men.
At 21:15 hours, he heard a response. 3 short whistles from the northeast. Morgan moved toward the sound. He gave the signal again. Another response. Closer now. In a clearing ahead, Morgan saw a figure. He approached cautiously, hand on the knife in his boot. Friend or enemy? "Morgan, is that you?" Chen's voice. The co-pilot. Morgan nearly collapsed with relief. "Chen, you made it!" The 2 men embraced briefly. Chen looked exhausted but uninjured. "I saw Russo and Hayes land together about a mile west," Chen said, "but I lost track of them. Have you seen anyone else?" "No, but we need to keep moving. There are patrols everywhere." They continued through the forest together, signaling periodically. At 22:45 hours, they found Russo and Hayes hiding in a barn. At 01:30 hours, they located O'Brien and Jackson together near a frozen creek. That made 6 survivors accounted for, not counting Klein and Walsh, who'd died in the initial attack. But Rivera, Anderson, and the others were still missing. Morgan gathered his crew. "Listen up. We're 90 miles inside enemy territory. The Swiss border is our best option, but that's a week of hard travel minimum. We need civilian clothes, food, and shelter. Staying together makes us more visible, but splitting up means we can't help each other. I'm giving you a choice. Come with me or go your own way. No judgment either way." Without hesitation, all 5 men chose to stay together. Morgan felt the weight of leadership settle back on his shoulders. He'd kept them alive when the bomber was burning. Now he had to keep them alive on the ground. They moved south through the night. Every time they heard vehicles or voices, they hid. At one point, they crossed a road and saw a German convoy passing. Trucks, half-tracks, and motorcycles. The war was still happening all around them. They were just trying to survive it. At dawn on February 24th, the crew found an abandoned hunting lodge deep in the forest. The building was in poor condition, but provided shelter from the wind. They would rest here during daylight and resume traveling after dark. Morgan posted sentries in shifts. Everyone got 2 hours of sleep. The chocolate bars were running low. They'd need real food soon. That afternoon, disaster struck. Jackson, who was on sentry duty, spotted German soldiers approaching the lodge. A patrol of 6 men. Jackson whistled the alarm. The crew scrambled out through the back windows and ran into the forest. The Germans opened fire. Bullets kicked up snow around Morgan's feet as he sprinted between trees. His crew scattered in all directions. Morgan dove behind a fallen log. Gunfire echoed through the forest. He could hear his men shouting, then screaming. Morgan crawled through the underbrush, trying to reach his crew. He could hear Germans shouting orders. More gunfire. Then silence. Morgan waited, barely breathing. Footsteps approached his position. He readied himself to fight. He wouldn't be captured without resistance. But the footsteps passed. The Germans were herding someone away. Morgan heard Chen's voice. "We surrender! We surrender!" Morgan remained hidden. He couldn't help his crew now. Attacking would only get everyone killed. The Germans marched their prisoners away. Morgan counted the voices. 4 men, Chen, Russo, Hayes, and O'Brien, had been captured.
Morgan waited until complete silence returned. Then he carefully moved through the forest. He found Jackson hiding under a snow-covered bush 200 meters from the lodge. The tail gunner was shaking violently, either from fear or cold, or both. "Where are the others?" Jackson whispered. "Captured," Morgan said quietly. "It's just us now." 2 men left, out of an original crew of 10. 2 dead, 6 captured. And now 2 fugitives trying to reach Switzerland with no food, no shelter, and German soldiers everywhere. The odds were not good. Morgan and Jackson traveled for 3 more days. They stole civilian clothes from a farmhouse. They stole potatoes from a root cellar. They slept in barns and abandoned buildings. They walked 30 miles, always moving south. On February 27th, their luck ran out. They were crossing an open field at dawn, having misjudged the timing. A farmer spotted them and shouted. Within minutes, police arrived. Morgan and Jackson had no weapons, no way to fight, no way to run. The police arrested them without violence. Morgan gave his name, rank, and serial number as required by the Geneva Convention. The police officer wrote it down, then pointed to a truck. Morgan and Jackson were driven to a Luftwaffe base, where other captured Allied airmen were being held. Morgan saw dozens of prisoners, British, Canadian, American, all looking exhausted, hungry, frightened. This was a collection point before transfer to permanent POW camps. A Luftwaffe officer interviewed Morgan. The officer spoke perfect English. "You are Lieutenant John Morgan, B-17 pilot?" "Yes." "Your bomber crashed near Regensburg on February 23rd? "Yes." "You stayed at the controls to allow your crew to escape?" Morgan hesitated. How did the officer know that? Then he understood. Some of his crew had been captured. They'd told their story. The Germans knew everything. "I did what any commander would do," Morgan said quietly. The officer studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You will be transferred to Stalag Luft 3. It is a camp for Air Force officers. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." Morgan spent the rest of the war at Stalag Luft 3. He survived near starvation. He survived brutal winters. He survived the infamous Long March, when the Germans evacuated the camp ahead of advancing Soviet forces in January 1945. He walked 90 miles in blizzard conditions with thousands of other prisoners. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. Morgan was liberated by British forces. He weighed 115 pounds. He'd lost 60 pounds during 15 months of captivity. When Morgan returned to the United States, he learned what had happened to his crew. Klein and Walsh had died in the bomber. Chen, Russo, Hayes, O'Brien, Rivera, and Anderson had all survived as POWs. Jackson had also survived. Everyone except the 2 men killed in the initial attack had made it home. Morgan received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions on February 23, 1944. The citation noted that his decision to remain at the controls of a burning aircraft had saved 9 lives. But Morgan never felt like a hero. He felt like a survivor who'd gotten lucky. But John Morgan's story represents just one thread in a much larger tapestry of sacrifice. To truly understand what his 4 minutes at the controls meant, we need to step back and look at the brutal reality of B-17 combat operations in 1944. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress became the symbol of American air power over Europe. More than 12,000 were built during the war. They delivered almost half of the 1.5 million tons of bombs the Allies dropped on Germany. But the statistics behind this success tell a darker story. Only 35% of B-17 airmen survived their required 25-mission tour of duty. That means nearly 2 out of every 3 men who climbed into a B-17 never made it home intact. They were killed, wounded, or captured. The odds were worse than playing Russian roulette. On a single mission to Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943, 60 of 291 B-17s failed to return. That's a 20% loss rate on one mission. 600 men gone in a single day. The raid was so catastrophic that the U.S. Army Air Forces temporarily halted deep penetration missions until long-range fighter escorts could be developed. The dangers came from every direction. German fighters attacked in coordinated waves, their cannons firing explosive shells that could shred aluminum skin like paper. Flak batteries on the ground threw up curtains of shrapnel that turned the sky black. A single flak burst could destroy an engine, puncture fuel tanks, or kill crew members instantly. But the aircraft itself presented dangers as severe as any enemy action. At 25,000 feet, the temperature dropped to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The waist gunner positions had open windows for their machine guns. Frostbite was more common than injuries from gunfire. Men lost fingers and toes. Some lost entire hands after prolonged exposure. The thin air at high altitude meant constant risk of anoxia. Oxygen systems frequently malfunctioned. Men would slowly lose consciousness without realizing it. By the time they noticed symptoms, they were already dying. Half of all airmen experienced some degree of oxygen deprivation during their tours. The position you flew determined your survival odds. Bombardiers died at the highest rate, 16.3% killed, 17.7% wounded. They sat in the nose of the aircraft, the most exposed position. Navigator casualties ran almost as high, 11.8% killed, 12.2% wounded. Tail gunners faced a 17.3% death rate. They sat alone at the furthest point from the rest of the crew, isolated in a tiny compartment with barely enough room to turn around. Pilots had the lowest casualty rates, 7.3% killed, 7.4% wounded. But this statistic is misleading. It suffers from what statisticians call survivor bias. If the pilot was killed or severely wounded, the entire aircraft usually crashed, taking all crew members with it. Dead pilots didn't make it into the wounded statistics because their bombers never came home. The ball turret gunner position became legendary as a death trap. But the statistics tell a more nuanced story. Ball turret gunners actually suffered fewer casualties than many other positions during flights. But when aircraft were shot down, ball turret gunners had the lowest survival rate. The ball turret hung beneath the aircraft's fuselage. To enter or exit, the gunner had to rotate the turret to a specific position, then climb up through a narrow hatch. This took time. Time that men didn't have when their bomber was falling out of the sky in pieces. There's a famous poem by Randall Jarrell called The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner.
5 lines long. It ends, "When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose." The imagery is horrific. It's also accurate. Beyond combat, training itself was deadly. 8,000 men died in training accidents before they ever reached combat zones. Mechanical failures, pilot error, weather. The B-17 was an unforgiving aircraft that demanded perfect execution from every crew member. And then there were the missions themselves. A standard bomb run went like this: pre-dawn wake-up, 0400 hours, breakfast of powdered eggs and coffee, briefing at 0500, officers and enlisted men separated, maps revealed, target announced. Intelligence officers described expected defenses. Chaplains offered prayers. Many men wrote letters home before missions, letters to be mailed only if they didn't return. 0630. Crew buses to aircraft. Pre-flight checks. Load bombs. Each B-17 could carry up to 8,000 pounds, though typical loads ran closer to 5,000. Bombs varied: general-purpose high explosives, incendiaries, fragmentation bombs. The ground crews, mechanics, armorers, fuel specialists, worked through the night to prepare aircraft. They painted bomb symbols on fuselages for each completed mission. They knew which crews were lucky and which weren't. 0700. Engine start. The Wright Cyclone engines coughed blue smoke, then roared to life. 4 engines per aircraft. 300 aircraft in a raid meant 1,200 engines creating a sound that shook the ground. Crew chiefs stood at attention and saluted as their aircraft taxied away. Some of those aircraft would never return. 0730. Takeoff. B-17s took off at 30-second intervals. Formation assembly took an hour. Aircraft circled at predetermined altitudes, joining up by group, then wing, then formation. Getting 300 bombers into proper formation was a massive coordination effort. Radio silence was mandatory. Pilots navigated by following lead aircraft. 0830. Formation complete. Head for Europe. The English Channel took 20 minutes to cross, then over France. The landscape below looked peaceful from 5 miles up. Fields, villages, roads. Hard to believe people down there were living under Nazi occupation. 0900. Crossing into Germany. This was when things got serious. German radar tracked incoming formations. Luftwaffe fighter squadrons scrambled. Anti-aircraft batteries prepared. The first fighters usually appeared at the German border. 0930. Fighter attacks began. FW-190s and BF-109s dove through formations in coordinated waves. Head-on attacks were most dangerous. The fighter closed at a combined speed of over 400 miles per hour. Both aircraft fired simultaneously. Whoever had better aim survived. The fighter flashed past in seconds. The bomber either stayed in formation or fell away trailing smoke. 1000. Flak corridor. As formations approached targets, they entered flak zones. German 88mm anti-aircraft guns fired shells that exploded at preset altitudes, creating clouds of shrapnel. The shells burst with black puffs. Hundreds of them. The sky turned into a maze of explosions. Pilots couldn't evade. Evasive action scattered bomb patterns. They had to fly straight and level through the flak. This was when crews felt most helpless. No way to fight back. Just sit and hope the next burst wasn't directly beneath their aircraft. 10:15. Bomb run begins. Bombardiers took control. The Norden bomb sight was a secret technology, supposedly capable of dropping bombs into pickle barrels from 20,000 feet. In reality, accuracy was far lower, but the technology was good enough. Bombardiers called out corrections. Left, right, steady, steady. When the target passed into the crosshairs, the bombardier pressed the release. The aircraft lurched upward as bombs fell away, suddenly several tons lighter. 10:20. Turn for home. The moment bombs dropped, pilots could finally maneuver. They banked hard, reducing time over target. But the German fighters weren't done. They knew damaged bombers would fall behind. Stragglers were easy prey. The flight home took 2 hours. Wounded aircraft struggled to maintain altitude. Some lost engines. Some lost pieces of their wings or tail sections.
Some flew home with dead crew members still at their stations. 12:30. England in sight. The white cliffs of Dover. Crews relaxed slightly, but landing damaged aircraft presented its own challenges. Blown tires, destroyed hydraulics, unresponsive controls. Some aircraft crashed on landing. Ambulances and fire trucks stood by at every airfield. 1300. Debriefing. Intelligence officers questioned crews. What did you see? How many fighters? What type? Where was the flak heaviest? Did you hit the target? The information was compiled, analyzed, fed into planning for the next mission. 1400. Rest. Try to sleep. Try to forget the empty bunks. Try not to think about tomorrow's mission, because there would be a tomorrow, and another day after that, until you completed 25 missions, or until you didn't come back. This was the reality that John Morgan and his crew faced every time they flew. The mission on February 23, 1944, was their 16th. They'd survived 15 before it. 9 more would have gotten them home, but that's not what happened. When Morgan held Yankee Doodle level for those 4 minutes, he was buying time for 9 men to escape an aircraft that was essentially a flying bomb. 2,000 gallons of aviation fuel. 5,000 pounds of explosives in the bomb bay that hadn't been dropped. Ammunition for 13 machine guns. All of it on fire. The aircraft could have exploded at any moment. Morgan knew this. He'd seen other bombers explode in midair. Everyone had. 1 second, a B-17 was flying in formation. The next second, it vanished in a fireball. No parachutes. No survivors. Just debris falling from the sky. Morgan chose to stay in that cockpit anyway. He chose to fight the controls of a dying aircraft to give his crew those extra seconds they needed. And it worked. 9 men got out. 9 men who would otherwise have died. That's not heroism in the Hollywood sense. There were no dramatic speeches, no stirring music, just a 23-year-old kid from Ohio, making a split-second decision and sticking with it, even when every survival instinct screamed at him to jump. And here's the thing that makes it even more remarkable. This wasn't unique. Pilots across the 8th Air Force made similar decisions on missions throughout the war. They stayed at the controls while their crews bailed out. They coaxed crippled bombers back to England rather than abandon aircraft over enemy territory. They landed gear up with dead engines to save their crews from having to jump. The B-17 created a particular culture among its crews. 10 men packed into a cramped aluminum tube, completely dependent on each other for survival. Pilots couldn't fly without navigators. Navigators couldn't navigate if engineers didn't keep engines running. Engineers couldn't do their jobs if gunners didn't keep fighters away. Every position was critical. Every man knew that his survival depended on 9 other men doing their jobs perfectly. This created bonds stronger than family. Crews ate together, slept in adjacent bunks, drank together on leave, and wrote letters to each other's families if someone didn't come back. They knew each other's hometowns, their girlfriends' names, their favorite foods, their fears. When Morgan held that bomber level, he wasn't saving 9 strangers. He was saving his brothers. After the war ended, John Morgan returned to Ohio. He weighed 115 pounds. The healthy, athletic young man who'd enlisted in 1942 looked like a skeleton. His mother didn't recognize him at first. 15 months as a prisoner of war had taken everything the Germans could take without killing him. Morgan spent 6 weeks in a hospital, gaining weight and recovering. The doctors said he was remarkably healthy, considering what he'd been through. But the physical wounds weren't the only scars. He had nightmares. Sudden, loud noises made him flinch. He couldn't sleep without lights on. These weren't things doctors could treat with medicine. In June 1945, Morgan received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Over 90,000 of these medals were awarded during World War II to Army Air Forces personnel who demonstrated heroism or extraordinary achievement during aerial flight. The medal featured a bronze cross with a centered propeller design, symbolizing aviation. The ribbon was blue, with white and red stripes. The citation accompanying Morgan's medal specifically noted his actions on February 23, 1944. It described how he maintained control of a burning aircraft to allow his crew to evacuate safely, prioritizing their lives over his own. The ceremony took place at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. Morgan's family attended. His crew members who had survived and returned home also came. When the officer presenting the medal pinned it to Morgan's uniform and shook his hand, Morgan felt nothing. No pride, no sense of accomplishment, just emptiness. He'd received a medal for doing what any pilot would have done. Meanwhile, Klein and Walsh were dead. Their families would get folded flags and telegrams expressing regret. The medal felt hollow. Morgan tried to return to normal life. He enrolled in college using the GI Bill. He studied engineering. He got married in 1947 to a woman named Sarah, who'd worked at a defense plant during the war. They had 3 children. Morgan never talked about the war. When his kids asked about the medal in the drawer, he changed the subject. Decades passed. Morgan worked as an engineer. He built a life. But the war never really left him. In the 1970s, B-17 reunions began. Veteran groups organized gatherings where former aircrew could reconnect. Morgan attended one in 1976. He saw Chen there, and Russo, and Hayes, men he hadn't seen since 1945. They talked for hours about what happened after they were captured, about the POW camps, about the Long March, about coming home. And for the first time, Morgan talked about those 4 minutes. Chen told him something Morgan hadn't known. When Chen had evacuated the rear crew members, several had refused to leave. They wanted to stay and help Morgan fly the aircraft. Chen had physically pushed them toward the escape hatch, ordering them to jump. Even knowing they were abandoning their pilot, some crew members had tried to resist. "They would have died with you if I hadn't forced them out," Chen said. "That's how much they trusted you." Morgan learned that his actions had ripples he'd never known about. After the war, O'Brien had named his first son John, after Morgan. Hayes had become a commercial pilot and had told Morgan's story to every trainee he'd ever instructed. Jackson had written letters to Morgan's family during the months when Morgan was missing, assuring them that their son had saved his life. In 1982, Morgan was invited to speak at a military academy. He'd never spoken publicly about the war before, but he was 70 years old now, and he understood that these stories needed to be told before everyone who remembered them was gone. He stood at a podium in front of hundreds of cadets, young faces, the same age he'd been when he climbed into Yankee Doodle for the last time. He told them about February 23rd, 1944, about the decision he'd made, about the 4 minutes. When he finished, a cadet raised his hand. "Sir, weren't you scared?" Morgan thought about the question. "Terrified," he admitted. But fear wasn't the deciding factor. Responsibility was. Those men were my crew, my responsibility. I couldn't abandon that responsibility to save myself. Another cadet asked, "Would you make the same decision again?" Morgan didn't hesitate. "Yes." Because that's what leadership meant. Not speeches or medals or recognition. Leadership meant doing the hard thing when it needed to be done, regardless of personal cost. Morgan lived until 2003. He died at the age of 81. His obituary mentioned his Distinguished Flying Cross. It mentioned his career as an engineer. It mentioned his family. But the people who attended his funeral remembered something else. Chen spoke at the service. He was 83 years old, using a cane, but his voice was strong. "John Morgan gave me 58 years I wouldn't have had. My children wouldn't exist. My grandchildren wouldn't exist. Everything I am, everything my family is, exists because one man made a choice in a burning cockpit over Germany. That's his legacy." The other surviving crew members echoed the sentiment. Russo, Hayes, O'Brien. They were old men now, but they remembered. They'd never forgotten. The B-17 Flying Fortress helped win World War II. The aircraft dropped more bombs on Germany than any other American bomber. The crews that flew them demonstrated courage that's difficult for modern audiences to fully comprehend. They climbed into aircraft knowing that statistically they probably wouldn't survive their tour. They did it anyway. John Morgan's story represents thousands of similar stories. Pilots who stayed at controls while crews evacuated. Navigators who guided crippled aircraft home. Gunners who continued fighting even after being wounded. Engineers who kept engines running through damage that should have destroyed them. These weren't superheroes. They were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Farmers from Iowa. Factory workers from Detroit. College students from Boston. teenagers from small towns who'd never flown before the war started. They became the men who flew through flak and fighters to strike at the heart of Nazi Germany. The numbers are staggering. The 8th Air Force alone suffered more than 47,000 casualties, 26,000 killed, and 21,000 prisoners of war. That's out of roughly 200,000 men who served in the command, nearly a quarter casualty rate. No other branch of the American military suffered proportional losses that high. Every mission was a gamble. Every takeoff carried the possibility of never returning. Yet they kept flying, day after day, mission after mission, until they completed their tours or until they didn't come back. What drives people to do that? What makes someone climb into a bomber after watching other bombers explode? What makes a pilot stay at the controls of a burning aircraft? The answer isn't complicated. It's the same answer that's driven soldiers throughout history. Loyalty to the people beside them. Duty to something larger than themselves. And the simple human desire to do the right thing when it matters most. John Morgan had 4 minutes to make a choice. In those 4 minutes, he defined who he was. Not just as a pilot, not just as an officer, but as a human being. 9 men lived because of that choice. 9 men who went on to have families, careers, and lives. Those 9 men produced children. Those children produced grandchildren. Today, hundreds of people exist because John Morgan held a burning bomber level for 4 minutes. That's not just heroism, that's immortality. When we tell these stories, we're not just recounting history. We're honoring the people who made sacrifices we can barely imagine. We're ensuring that their actions aren't forgotten. We're passing down examples of courage, duty, and selflessness to new generations who will face their own trials. The B-17 Flying Fortress is gone now. Most of the surviving aircraft are in museums or air shows. The men who flew them are almost all gone too. John Morgan died 21 years ago. Chen died in 2015. The last surviving member of Morgan's crew, Henry Jackson, died in 2019 at the age of 94. But their story remains. And as long as we remember it, they're not truly gone. The next time you see an old photograph of a B-17 crew standing beside their aircraft, smiling for the camera despite knowing what they're about to face, remember John Morgan. Remember that behind every aircraft, there are stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. And remember those 4 minutes, because in those 4 minutes, one man showed us what it really means to be a leader, a crew member, and a human being. If John Morgan's story of courage and sacrifice moved you, hit that like button right now. Stories like this take hours of research to bring to you, and your support helps us uncover more forgotten chapters of World War II history. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another extraordinary tale of heroism and human endurance from the greatest conflict in history. And we want to hear from you. In the comments below, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Are you in the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, Germany, or somewhere else entirely? We have viewers from over 100 countries, and your stories and perspectives make this channel a truly global community.
Drop your country in the comments and let us know what you think about Lieutenant Morgan's sacrifice. Would you have made the same choice? We read every single comment, and your insights often inspire our next videos. Thank you for being part of World War II Records. Until next time, remember the past, honor the fallen, and never forget the stories that shaped our world.